Before we talk about what's going on in this week's chapters of Breshit, I want to share a personal story. The other night, my 8-year-old son came into my room, when he should have been in bed, with a question. I could tell what was going on and was expecting him to ask for some water or to need to tell me just one more thing about what happened in art class that day. Instead, he asked me why certain countries didn't exist until relatively recently, and why entities like the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires disappeared after World War I. I was flummoxed. This kid, who still loves his bedtime snuggles and can wax rhapsodic about the many and various evolved forms of different Pokemon, was coming to me with intellectual curiosity and depth. Oh, and he was definitely still trying to delay bedtime. But all of a sudden, I saw him with new eyes. And I realized that I needed to up my parenting game to support and nurture my growing child. And yes, get him to go to bed. In this week's chapters of Breshit, we're immersed in the early myths of the Torah. As humankind begins to proliferate across the earth, so do our baser ways. We read of God's anger and the familiar story of Noach and the flood. After the waters recede, the dove brings back an olive branch, and the rainbow appears as God's promise never again to destroy the world. Then we round out this section by listing the 10 generations that take us from Noach to Avram. I used the word myths to describe this section of the Torah, and it has much in common with the mythologies of other ancient cultures. One of the strongest points of connection is the personality of God. Like mythological deities, the God of this part of Breshit is emotional, rash, and struggling to learn how best to care for and interact with the world that was so recently set spinning. Let's look at a passage that feels very mythological. The beginning of chapter 6, when divine beings marry earthly women, giving rise to, as the Torah describes, giants and great heroes of old. When God sees what's going on, God says, Lo yadon ruchi va'adam le'olam b'shagam hu vasar. My breath, or spirit, shall not abide in humankind forever, since it too is flesh. Chapter 6, verse 3. Scholars and commentators have suggested multiple interpretations for this verse. The Or HaChaim, Rabbi Chaim Ibn Attar from 18th century Morocco, says, it appears that the Torah wishes to tell us that a change occurred in God's dealings with humankind. Earlier in human history, God followed people's actions very closely, rewarding them for every success and punishing them for each tiny infraction. As people functioned more independently, not always in accordance with what God wanted, God decided not to deal with them on such an intimate basis. God saw that the people had their own distinct identity and realized that they were no longer an extension of divinity into the world. They had become, and needed to be, more fully human. In response, God took a step back. Through the lens of the Or HaChaim, I see God here as a parent, taking a necessary moment to figure out how to deal with the children now that they are growing in new directions. They are no longer the same they once were, and so God also needs to be different. I could not help but think about this idea as I reflected on my late-night geopolitical history conversation with my son. He's becoming someone more unique, interesting, and independent every day. In order to nurture him and be the best mother for him I can be, I need to see his emerging self as fully as I can and tailor my approach to the kid I see in front of me at each new moment. I can't wait to hear what he asks me about tomorrow night.